All right, so good evening to all of you, my dear brothers and sisters who are here. Thank you for making your little sacrifice, to spend this evening together with us, so that we'll be able to uh, think together about some matters that are related to our faith communities. So this evening, what I would like to share with you is on this whole topic of creativity. And if I'm given a choice to entitle this little formation or this talk, I would call it the CCC, not as in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, but the Christian call to creativity. The Christian call to creativity. Now, of course, whenever we think of the term creativity, we tend to think of doing something artistic, making something, inventing something, right? Creating something. Uh, and of course, we know that the source of creativity for us is God Himself. But God is able to create in a way that none of us creatures are able to create. God can create ex nihilo, which means God can create out of nothing. God's creative power is such that just through the power of His word, just by willing for something to be created, or just by willing for something to exist, that thing will exist by His will and in accordance with His order. He does not need raw material to create anything. All right. And so our creativity as creatures that are made in His image and likeness comes from God. But our creativity is different from God's creativity. Our creativity is, if you like, a borrowed creativity. We are an extension of God's creativity in the sense that we need to use raw materials that are created by God in order for us to create anything. We cannot do without raw materials, right? If you want to build a house, you must have stone, bricks, sand, cement, all sorts of raw materials, okay? And as you move up that chain of raw materials, it will be something that we get from nature that is created by God Himself. So we are not able as man to create anything that doesn't come from God. Whereas God Himself, just by the power of His word alone, He's able to create anything He wills. Okay, so that's the difference between our creativity and God's creativity. But I want to say this about creativity. Creativity is not just about making things. It's more than just about making things. Creativity is also about the ability to adapt ourselves to circumstances and changing realities. You know that someone once said, the only consistent thing in life is change. Everything else is inconsistent, right? And therefore, if there is something that you can be guaranteed of tomorrow morning when you wake up, it is that you are waking up to a different world. Because as you were asleep throughout the night, the world would have changed in many different ways, ways that are known to you as well as ways that are unknown to you. All right. Creativity in our human life includes being able to adapt ourselves to the change that takes place on a daily basis. This current COVID-19 pandemic has caused a lot of change in this world, and people struggle to adapt themselves to these changes, even when you want to travel, right? Like many of us, many of you were working just across the causeway, right? We live in Johor Bahru, and many of you all these years have been working across the causeway in Singapore. And you had a certain way of life of traveling there, coming back, commuting each day, or some of you commuting during the weekends, coming back to Johor Bahru, to be with your family, and then on Sunday night, Sunday evening, or Monday morning, traveling over to Singapore and spending the weekdays there for your work. But the pandemic that brought about a closure to our national borders necessitated for us to adapt to a new way of working, right? And so today we keep talking about working from home. That is part of creativity, finding ways to continue with our work, but in a different environment from the environments that we were used to prior to the onset of the pandemic. All right, so that too is creativity. Now, why is creativity important? It is important because we see creativity in the life of our Lord Jesus. When you look in the Bible, you read the Gospels, and you see Jesus, how he conducted himself and how he conducted his ministry throughout his 3 years of earthly ministry, of public ministry. You will see that Jesus actually models creativity, a very deep kind of creativity in his approach towards life and ministry. He was creative in the way he communicated with people. You notice that Jesus spoke a lot to people. He dealt a lot with people, and that is the nature of ministry anyway. And in the way he spoke to them, in the way he communicated with them, he used a lot of parables, stories, so that people would understand what he said and would be able to connect with the parables that he told, in order that divine truth would be able to be accepted by them, by the people who listened to him. And besides that, Jesus also used a lot of humor, and he even used some literary devices like exaggeration, hyperbole. These are all things that you see, of course, today as modern readers of the gospel. If we don't study the gospel seriously, we don't see all these things coming in our readings. We don't see these realities because we are so familiar with these passages and we take them at face value. But if you study the gospels seriously, you will see Jesus using all these different creative ways of communicating verbally to the people who listened to the things that he said, in order to receive the divine truth that he came to bring to them. You will also see creativity in the way Jesus dealt with situations, with life situations. Whenever he led people in the Gospels, he would create situations that would enable people to learn. Let me give you an example. Remember his friend Lazarus, who died, right? And Jesus now was receiving this news that his friend Lazarus, who lived in Bethany, was sick, right? Remember, he was speaking with his disciples, speaking with the crowd, and then somebody comes and says, your friend Lazarus is very sick. The family is calling for you, right? And what does Jesus do? Does he go immediately? No. If you read the gospel passage, it's almost as if Jesus deliberately remains in that place so that he could time himself to arrive at the place of Lazarus's tomb late. He intentionally wants to arrive late. And so by the time Jesus arrives at the place of Lazarus's burial, of course, when he received the news, he was sick. So by the time Jesus arrives, Lazarus is dead, okay? And he is already entombed. He's buried in the tomb already. And it's like Jesus purposely times himself to arrive late. After 3 days, on the 4th day, then he arrives at that place. Why does Jesus do that? If you know that your close friend is sick, wouldn't you rush there if you know that you would be able to help him? But no, Jesus is actually using this situation in a creative way. How? You see, because the Jews during the time of Jesus, they used to believe, it's not necessarily true, but this was their belief at the time, all right, that when a person dies, his soul still lingers around the body, waiting for an opportunity to perhaps unite with the body again. In other words, they believe that within 3 days of a person's death, this person can be resuscitated. It is only after 3 days that the soul loses hope and the soul departs from that locality. So in other words, in their understanding, after 3 days, there is no more hope of a dead person rising to life again. And so what does Jesus do? He times himself to arrive at the time when the soul supposedly has left the location. So he times himself to arrive at the scene at a time when there is no more possibility of Lazarus, his good friend, rising from the dead. Why does he do that? Because he wants to demonstrate to the people around watching that he is the one who gives life. That if Lazarus rises to life, without the soul being there, without the possibility of the soul uniting to the body, then Jesus himself, who raises Lazarus from the dead, is the one who is the source of life. You see? So he was using this situation as an object lesson for the people. That's creativity, you see? Because he's teaching something to the people around there in a way that they will never, ever forget. Had Jesus arrived early and raised Lazarus from the dead, they might probably not have seen it as a miracle. They might have seen it as, well, yes, a possibility because the soul is still lingering around there. So somehow Jesus maybe performed a small little miracle by summoning the soul back into the body, but there was no creative act of raising someone who was dead to life by giving life to that person, right? But Jesus wanted people to know that he is the resurrection and the life. And as far as he was concerned, what an excellent situation. What an excellent timing for him to teach this truth about himself as the source of life. Okay, now let me give you another example. The long homily that Jesus was preaching on the Sermon on the Mount, right? I'm sure you would have read that, or at least heard it being read to you from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5 to chapter 7, 3 chapters worth of homily. This is the longest homily that Jesus has ever been recorded as preaching. And where was he preaching it? He was preaching it on a high place. That's why it's called Sermon on the Mount. I like to call it Sherman on the Mount because that's my name. Okay, but he was preaching this Sermon on the Mount, or the homily that he was speaking to the people, teachings that he was delivering on the high place, or on that high plain, on the mountain. All right. Now, why did Jesus lead them to that place to teach them? Who were the people who would usually go up onto the mountain? During the time of Jesus, they were under the occupation of the Roman Empire, right? And the local people, the Jews, they wanted the Romans to be expelled from Israel because they wanted independence. They wanted their own government. And so very often, there would be these revolutionaries, who wanted to plot to come up against the Roman government. And where would they plot all these conspiracies? They would bring people, their friends, who would be able to fight with them. They would bring them up onto these high places, onto these mountains that were quite deserted, so that they wouldn't be caught. And there on these mountains, they would start plotting a revolution to expel the government out of Israel. All right. So can you imagine what was in people's minds when Jesus was leading the crowd up onto this mountain? They probably saw him as a revolutionary. They probably saw him as someone who was going to bring them onto the mountain to do what? To show them his plan on how he was going to expel the Roman Empire, how he was going to lead the people to battle the authorities, these illegitimate authorities, to kick them out of Israel. Can you imagine the expectation? And lo and behold, when they sit down and they listen to Jesus's so-called battle plan, what does he say? Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are you who look for peace and who make peace. Blessed are you when you forgive your enemies and those who ridicule you, those who persecute you. Imagine the shock, the horror they experienced when they heard Jesus saying all these things, because they were expecting Jesus to teach them how to fight. And Jesus was teaching them to do what? To make peace, to love, and to forgive, because the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God that he came to bring is antithetical. It goes against the values of society. So you can imagine this homily that was preached by Jesus goes totally in contradiction to what they were expecting him to say. You imagine the shock that they would have experienced, right? It was a homily that they would never forget for the rest of their lives. And Jesus uses this experience as an opportunity to communicate his kingdom to them creatively, effectively. And that is the Jesus that we see in the Gospels, a creative Christ. And therefore, we are called to follow in his footsteps in bringing the gospel to society in creative ways. In fact, when you read the Gospels, you will see that the most creative thing God did eventually was to show us his love by becoming a man. Not only did he become a man, he became a man, and for our sake, he allowed himself to be put to death. And after his death, what happened? He rose from the dead. The most excellent creative action of God, to die and then to not be bound by this death, but to overcome it and to rise to life. That is God's creative action. Today, in the modern day, we experience an abundance of resources in our lives, right? We have more money than we need, actually. How much money do we need to survive? Not that much, but many of us have more than we actually need. Technology. We have more technology than we actually need. Yes, thank God for technology. We thank God that we are able to have this kind of an online session, formation, discussion, all right, using technology. But there is also a lot of technology that we use which we actually don't need, right? So we have abundance of it. Even time. We actually have a lot of time on our hands. You just imagine how much time we spend daily on social media. This is all our spare time that we have, because we are taking less time to travel from one place to another, because we have modern means of transportation. We are taking less time to communicate with people because we have all sorts of different efficient ways to communicate with one another. All right. So we have a lot of time on our hands. And what do we do with it? We spend a lot of this time on social media. When it comes to resources, our resources that we have in our lives are abundant. And yet, despite having so much resources, creativity among people is increasingly becoming a challenge. It's increasingly becoming a problem. Somehow, do you notice or not that it seems like the more modern people get, the less creative they become? For those of you who grew up in small towns, in villages, do you remember during those days when we grew up, we did not grow up with very well-to-do families. We lived in small towns. We didn't have access to a lot of technology at that time. And whatever technology that there was in terms of our toys and all these as children, the high-tech toys were very expensive and our parents could never afford to buy them for us. So how did we play with toys? Didn't we create our own toys? I remember as a little boy, digging holes in the ground, playing marbles with my friends, all right? And those marbles, I actually stole them from the fish aquarium in my own home, My mother put those marbles in the aquarium and I dug those marbles out from the aquarium to bring them to play with my friends, And we found the most creative places. We would dig little holes, draw lines on the sand under the tree, kites, every time it was windy season, we used to like to play kites, right? Well, my parents did not always buy nice kites for me. Many times I had to make my own kites. I would cut newspaper, use the little Libby stick, and use the cellophane tape, scotch tape, to and some glue and then newspapers, all right, to fold my own kite and make the tail and all that. We were very creative when we were young because we were lacking in resources. So we were forced to be creative. But now, because life has become so convenient, just with money, you can get anything you want. People have now laxed in the exercise of creativity. It seems like there is no need to be creative anymore. You just need to have money and you can buy whatever convenience that you want, right? Even children today, you don't see them folding many things, making many things. You don't see that. Why? Because they just want to play electronic games, which actually might lead to a lack of creativity. The minute you take away those electronic games from them, they don't know what to do with their time anymore, because they have never had to exercise their mind to do something creative with their time. You see, and this is the melody of the modern life. We have this problem today among modern people, whether we are children or adults, all right? So today, somehow people don't seem to be very creative anymore. Now, part of creativity is really problem solving. That's why when we were young, we had a problem when we were children. We needed to play with toys. We wanted toys. I mean, which child doesn't want toys, right? We needed to play with toys, but our parents couldn't afford them. So that was a problem, right? So how did we solve the problem? We made toys ourselves, right? Now, there is no problem to be solved as long as your parents have money. And of course, part of the fault is now on us. Now, we parents are the ones who are spoiling our children by removing all the problems so they don't have any problems to solve, right? And so since their problems are being solved for them, our problems are also being solved for us, no need for creativity. And therefore, the modern mind, in many ways, has become lazy, has become lethargic. We don't want to think anymore. And this is generally true of modern society. You know, it's our minds are lazy, all right? So it's generally true of modern society. And if something is true of society, guess what? When you look at the community in the church, what do you see? You see the same kind of people. After all, our members in the church are members of society, aren't they? And therefore, if as members of society, they are lazy to think and they refuse to exercise creativity, what do you see then in the church? You see many people who are lazy to exercise any kind of creativity. Societal behavior is reflected in the church, right? And, you know, as a deacon, I see that very much in the life of the church, in the life of the parishes that I visit, in the life of my own parish that I'm serving in as well. I give you some examples of laziness. You know, I don't mean laziness as in people not wanting to work, you know, but laziness as in not wanting to think and not wanting to exercise creativity. For example, during this pandemic, there were a few lockdowns that we went through, right? And until today, very few parishes are able to actually gather the children to have catechism classes. And so who is supposed to be responsible for the faith of the children? The parents, of course. Especially during a time like now, like the pandemic, parents have to take responsibility for the faith of the children. Are they doing it? No, they just keep asking us, when is class starting? When is class starting? Can we have online classes? You know, in the first place, in the understanding of the church, it has always been that parents were the ones who were supposed to be primarily responsible for the faith of the children, not the catechism teachers, not the catechists in the parish. Parents are the primary witnesses. But over the years, because of laziness, this job is just thrown at the catechism ministry. And even during a pandemic, many parents, not all, there are many parents who are doing very well. And I know many of these families in my parish, right? But there are many families also where you see the parents continuing in that laziness of not wanting to be mindful of the spiritual development of the children. And one day, if these children don't grow up well in the faith, they will blame the church. It's the church's fault. When actually the children, how long do they have in the church every week? At most, give it 2-3 hours. That's if they do have that amount of time in the church physically, right? But parents are the ones who are supposed to be living with them every day and night. The parents are supposed to be the ones to bring the faith to the children. But no, many of them refuse to exercise any kind of creativity. Of course, we are not saying that teaching the faith to the parents is an easy thing, to the children is an easy thing. No, it's difficult. It's a challenge. All right. But nevertheless, as parents, if we care for the faith of our children, what do? We try to find ways to overcome this challenge for the sake of our children's salvation. That is creativity, right? So it is a problem that I see. And this is just an example, of how creativity is lacking in the church today. Okay. Another example that we see, now this one is not so much an example in the church, but in society generally, many people have been affected by the pandemic in terms of their livelihood. They are suffering financially because of the pandemic. Even for myself, my livelihood too has been affected by the pandemic. But right from the early days of the pandemic, I already realized some amount of creativity has to be exercised in order for me to adapt so that at least I can get a little bit of income from some sources, and of course I would try to get some income from as many different sources as I can in order to survive. Even if I cannot get more than I need, at least something just to tide over the pandemic. And it requires what? Creativity. You have to learn to think out of the box so that you can find some ways to make some money in order to survive. And you make sure that the way you make money is legal, of course, right? So all this requires creativity. And we see a lot of people being stuck there during this pandemic, stuck in the creativity, not able to find creative ways to overcome the challenge of the pandemic. All right. And in the course of my mission, as a preacher, as a teacher of the faith, I have traveled to many parts of the world. And in some places that I go to, the societies are economically probably 20, 30, even 40 years behind Malaysia. And the people are not advanced. They are comparatively poor. They are not well-to-do. And many of them are farmers, actually. They are farming communities. But you know what I see when I go to these societies to visit them, these communities to visit them? I see a lot of creativity. And therefore, when I visit these communities, I'm always very highly inspired to see how they learn to manage and to make a meaningful life out of the little that they have. And we, with all that we have, supposedly being able to exercise creativity, we lack creativity, and we only come up with more complaints about what we should have that we don't have. And those people have so much less than us, but they are happy with what they have, and they are able to see what to do with what they have. The applications, they creatively come up with so many applications for the little that they have, and they make do with life. I've seen communities that are so creative that even if you brought money, cash to them, they would reject it because they would say, what would we use this money for? We have everything that we need. Whatever we need, we make with our hands. We don't need this money. There are communities that exist like that around the world, Whereas for us, money buys everything. Money buys convenience. Money buys us the privilege of being mentally lazy. And this is something that Christians need to overcome. Because as we look at our lives today, as we look at the lives of your communities, you will see that everyone's life, even in the modern world, and especially during a pandemic, everyone's life has certain situations that call for creativity. And if we don't respond to these circumstances of our lives creatively, then we will never overcome. We will never overcome the challenges that confront us in terms of finances, in terms of our work situation, in terms of our relationships. It also takes creativity, in order for us to sustain relationships. If our relationships are not creative, then those relationships might die. It might turn negative because we are not able to sustain the relationship in a way that develops each other in all our relationships, whether it's in the family or outside the family. All right. So practically everything in life requires creativity. And part of the Christian witness is the call to be creative. As Christians, there is a call for us to be creative, because it is in being creative that we truly appreciate the gifts that God has given to us in our lives. It is in being creative that we will be able to communicate the power of the gospel to people. We can demonstrate to people what it means to use God's blessings and God's gifts for us to create beautiful things, to create beauty in life for ourselves as well as for other people. It is in being creative that we will be able to preach the gospel effectively to people in ways that they are able to connect with, and in ways that they are able to understand, and in ways that they are able to remember. So all these reasons account for why it's important for us to be creative as Christians. Okay, now I want to explain something more to you. This part may be a little bit more abstract, maybe a little bit deeper, but try and understand this. In the year 2004, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who was going to be the future Pope Benedict the 16th, he became the Pope in April 2005, if I'm not mistaken, right? But in the year 2004, at that time he was Cardinal Ratzinger. He gave a speech, and during this speech, he spoke something about European civilization. And of course, we all know when as Asians, when we look at the West, we see a lot of moral decay in the West, right? Not only are they in moral decay, we actually see them celebrating moral decay. They are talking about all this moral decay as if these are actual virtues that they are supposed to stand up for and defend, right? That's why you see so many of these things happening in the West today. And we say, well, they brought it upon themselves in their society. And Cardinal Ratzinger saw that from the early 2000s, all right? And he said that Western civilization is a civilization that is in decline. One day, this civilization will be so much in decline because the people have lost their faith and they have lost their sense of morality. And as Asians, we are able to see that, right? So basically, the Western culture only exalts itself. Only Westerners think highly of themselves, and they think that the rest of the world are supposed to think highly of them too. But as Asians, when we look at them, we say, no, this is not what I want my children to become. And it would be very pitiful if my children embrace those kinds of values. But Ratzinger, from the early 2000s, he saw this from long ago, right? But in the early 2000s, in his speech, he said this, that the Western civilization is going to be in decay, and it's going to be characterized by a lot of moral decay. You will see decay in the identity, in the culture, in the way of life, in the religious and the value system of Western civilization. Okay? And he said, therefore, what are the Christians going to do? Those Christians who are in the West, many of them will go for this moral decay, they also will be swept by the currents of moral decay. He says, but there will be a minority, a small community of Christians who refuse to follow the direction of that decay, who refuse to be swept by the currents of this moral decay. What would they have to do? He borrowed a term that was propagated by this historian called Arnold Toynbee. He says, these Christians, they have to live their lives as a creative minority. And this is the term that I wanted to introduce to you, a creative minority. The Christians who want to be faithful to the gospel in the context of a society that has become corrupted by moral decay and religious decay, all right? And a decay in their culture, a decay in their values. But these few Christians who want to remain faithful to the message of the gospel and survive in that society, what do they have to do? They have to live as a minority that is creative. And that's why Cardinal Ratzinger called them the creative minority. They have to find ways to survive. They have to survive in ways that are creative. But in order for them to survive this kind of corrupted culture, they have to be willing to suffer. They have to be willing to live their lives with a deep conviction that they are doing what is right, that they are living their lives righteously in the eyes of God by refusing to follow the currents of society. And they have to hold on to this ideal of being a creative minority. In a world where it is fashionable for people to contradict the teachings of the church, because they say the church is old-fashioned, the church is archaic, we have to progress in our values, we have to follow the times, and they will laugh at the Catholic Church, they will mock the Catholic Church, they will despise those who call themselves Catholics. These people who want to remain Catholics have to be a creative minority. They who remain faithful, or who choose to remain faithful to the teachings of the faith, they will experience temptation. They will experience temptation. They will be tempted to follow the currents, but they will fight it. They will also experience isolation because they will be discriminated against. They will be criticized. They will be mocked. They will not be accepted. And they will also suffer in their workplaces because they will be bypassed for any promotions, any pay rise, any kind of recognition, because they are not respected. They are seen as people who are old-fashioned, right? But what do they do as a creative minority? They have to think creatively and find ways to remain faithful to the teachings of the church, remain faithful to the faith, while still trying to engage with society so that they remain relevant. Because if they are not relevant to society anymore, then what happens to the power of the gospel in society? There will be no one to bring the gospel to society anymore. So these people have to be in society. They have to remain relevant despite not being loved by society. So they have to be creative in the way they engage with the larger culture of society, in order that they can remain faithful on the one hand, but on the other hand, they can still bring the gospel in ways that are effective and powerful to others. Now, Cardinal Ratzinger was talking about the creative minority in the context of the West. Are we saying that in Asia, this is not true? No. Although people generally are still religious, if you compare with the West, people here are religious, that doesn't mean that they are living their lives based on good religious values. Very often, people follow the rituals of their religion, but when they go to their workplace, when they function in society, they follow corrupted values. They follow values that contradict what is good and what is right, right? And in order for us to survive in this society that goes in directions that contradict the integrity of the gospel, if you want to prosper in this society, you have to follow the values of society by contradicting the gospel yourself. So how do you survive if you want to remain a faithful Catholic, a faithful Christian in a society like this? You have to be a creative minority. You have to be creative in the way you engage with society. And you have to be resolved in how faithful you are to the gospel. At the same time, you have to think creatively of how you as a Christian are called to bring this gospel in creative ways, maybe subtle, but creative ways to the rest of society. And therefore, creativity is a non-negotiable in the Christian life. If we are not creative, then it will affect the power and the effectiveness of our witness.